Yes, welcome everyone. I thought that everyone was waiting here and it was so crowded because everyone wanted to hear Nathan speak, but now people are leaving. Are you saying you wanted to listen to the Chancellor instead? Welcome everyone to Republica and to this session. Welcome Nathan, we're very glad to have you.
Thanks.
For people who don't know your background, I wanted to briefly introduce you a bit further. So you've been many things. You were a student leader at the Hong Kong protests. You've been a legislator. In fact, the youngest legislator ever elected to the Hong Kong Legislative Council until your election was overturned. You've been a political prisoner, and now you're an activist in exile who has left Hong Kong. I want to kind of start by, so I want to go through time a bit, and so I want to look at the past first. And one thing I wanted to talk about is I think people have a vague sense that Hong Kong is part of China. It's a special administrative region, but a lot of things are quite different, or were quite different for a long time. So I think for you, what are the things that make Hong Kong distinct from China, or what's similar?
Well, thank you, Katharin. So today's topic is about how we can fight against authoritarianism. And one thing that we must recognize before we get into this topic is that there is a rise of authoritarianism, and that's the reason why how we resist the expansion. This is a crucial question for many of us, not only for the people who are living in authoritarian regime or under totalitarian regime, but we can, of course, seeing democracy being eroded in the democratic countries that we used to think. So I think this is not only a problem for Hong Kong, not only a problem of China, of Russia, but actually it is a problem that we face together, and we have to find solutions together. And I always think about Hong Kong's example as a way that you could see how authoritarianism can erode a city with freedom, with a really deep ingrained civil society in such a quick way. It's just like a slap. Hong Kong's freedom are all gone in just a few years of time. So when I look back to my trajectory as an activist, as a political figure, I started campaigning for democracy in 2014 when I was a student leader. We had a massive civil disobedience movement called Umbrella Movement that hundreds of thousands of people occupied the major runway of Hong Kong in order to say that we want democracy. Because Hong Kong, our chief executive, the leader of our city, are by no means elected by Hong Kong people. It is purely appointed by Beijing. So we demanded for democracy, and there was certain room for us to discuss, to do civil disobedience, and to kind of engage in civil resistance. And when the time goes, when I was elected as the youngest lawmaker in Hong Kong history, at the age of 23 in 2016, we still had certain leverage in the legislature, that we can talk about policy, then we can try to hold the government accountable, that we can propose something that people have their power back. But after that, if the situation of Hong Kong deteriorated so rapidly, in 2017, I was unseated because Beijing's intervention. So I lost my seat because Beijing doesn't like me. And then I was being put in jail because my participation in the peaceful demonstration in 2014, and for now, because of the implementation of the national security law, which criminalized Hong Kong's free speech and put basically all of my friends in politics in jail, I had to leave Hong Kong. And through through my prism of my trajectory, you could really see how quick Hong Kong has deteriorated and how much its impact has been to the people, making people to be imprisoned, to flee, unable to go back to Hong Kong. If I were to go back to Hong Kong today, I would be facing decades of imprisonment just because of my political activism. And for now, I'm actually a political refugee in the United Kingdom. So that kind of change of my personal status can give you a hint or an understanding of what Hong Kong has become. It's just an authoritarian police state.
I think one thing that you just mentioned regarding the erosion of freedoms speaks to something that I think is important to talk about, because in 2012, so 10 years ago, Hong Kong wasn't a democracy by most standard definitions. Hong Kong is not a democracy today, but you say that there is a substantial change, right? And I think being in Berlin, for example, looking towards, for instance, Hungary, I think people are starting to get a sense of how slow change can happen, and that it's not just from one day to the next. So can you maybe help us understand what's changed in the last 10 years? For example, what are things that would have been possible 10 years ago in Hong Kong, but that might not be possible anymore?
Yeah, so 3 years ago today, in 2019, 9th of June, there were more than 1 million Hong Kong people marching down to the streets. Hong Kong is a city with 7.5 million people. And on 16th of June, which is 1 week later, in 2019, there were more than 2 million of them marching down to the streets. Just try to imagine in Berlin, in any city or even in the country, that if there are more than a quarter of your population going down to the street and saying that we want change, we need democracy, the German government would probably collapse, another regime will come up, another ruling party, but nothing happened in Hong Kong. The chief executive came out and said that, oh, we recognize your voice, but we will continue to roll out our campaign to limit your freedom. So basically, that was what happened 3 years ago. And by then, we could still protest. We could still go down to the street and hold a sign of saying that I want democracy, or we are against dictatorship. We want to end one-party system in mainland China. We want competitive democracy. But for now, if you were to do so, it is most certainly you will be arrested. And many of my friends, they were involved in a primary election, which it happens everywhere. In every democracy, every major party, they have own primary election in order to pick the best candidate for election. But many of my friends who joined 2 years ago in the primary election are for now being locked in jail for more than 1.5 years without a trial because of the national security law. They were basically saying that under that law, if you wanted a majority in the legislature, if you wanted to oppose government's bill, you are committing a subversive action which destabilizes the country, which damage the national security, and then you will be submitted to a court that there are no jury, the government handpicked the judges, and the law is vaguely defined in order to persecute you. So nothing like that would take place like even 3 years ago, even 5 years ago, or even 10 years ago. Everything changed so rapidly in just a few years of time. And the result is the Hong Kong we used to know is gone. The freedom of speech that we used to have to freely criticize the government, to freely propose a political opinion, to have a different voice other than the one Chinese Communist Party is having, is gone. And people who have said those things are paying the price now. My friend Joshua Wong, for example, he's in jail for more than 1.5 years. And for people like Jimmy Lai, a media person who runs a company now being closed by the government, is possibly facing decades of imprisonment. He's now a 17-year-old man. He may not get out of jail alive. Many have predicted that. So I guess we used to think about Hong Kong as the Pearl of Orient, one of the freest cities in Asia, but it has completely changed. It's just an ordinary, very authoritarian city under Beijing's dictatorship.
So just very briefly to make sure that people understand what you went onto the streets for in 2014, 2019, often when people hear that there were elections in Hong Kong and, for example, that you were elected to parliament, one reaction I hear in Germany is, oh, but if people get to vote, then there is democracy. So what do people want? So what did you want when you protested in 2014 and 2019? And yeah.
So the election system in Hong Kong has been changing, constantly changing. And in 2014, we have half of the seats in the parliament are elected by people, and half of them, basically majority of them, are appointed by Beijing. So even though we have kind of like half of the popularly contested seats, And we, the pro-democracy camp, have always been majority in terms of voting. But inside the council, because so many seats are reserved for Beijing candidates, we are always minority. And for the chief executive, it is elected by an election committee that most of the people are appointed by Beijing. So at the end of the day, it is a small circle election handpicked by the top authority of Beijing. So we have never had democracy. But for now, things get worse, obviously. In the legislature, we only have 20 out of 19 seats that are elected through popular election. And the pro-democracy basically completely boycotted the election because we don't want it to have a facade to say that, oh, there are competition. And for now, all of the people sitting in the parliament are from the pro-Beijing camp, even though the pro-democracy camp have always been popular, majority in popular voting. And for the chief executive, it's basically handpicked. So you can see there is a massive change in Hong Kong system to make it more and more under Beijing's control, and less room for civil society, for issues that we have attached to and we wanted to change. So it's basically a silence in Hong Kong that people dare not to speak up, and the police will crack any dissent group if they were to be outspoken.
So kind of going into this question of how do we fight authoritarianism, I think one thing about your trajectory that's quite fascinating is you've protested in the streets, you've been active in established student organizations, you've been elected to parliament, you co-founded a party, Demosisto, after the 2014 protests, and now you're an activist in exile. And so I wonder, looking back on the last few years, are there moments where you look back at it and you wish you had done something differently, right? So if someone who's in a similar situation now to you a few years ago, where they might think, oh, I think things are going to get worse, what do you wish you had known 10 years ago? Is there anything you would have changed?
Well, it's definitely a good question, and I think it should be answered by all of us because, as I said, the case of Hong Kong is not only reflecting how expensive, how confident the Chinese Communist Party is to its totalitarian system, but at the end of the day, it's about the global democratic backsliding. We've been seeing even member states in European Union is also rolling back its democracy, it's also persecuting minority, rolling back its progress throughout the time. And even though we're in Germany, we're in democratic country, we also have to answer a question, is how we can fight against this wave. It's not only the problem of Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is just an implication of that. It's one piece of puzzle in a big picture that actually we have been so complacent and reluctant to react for the past decade, or two, possibly. I think the invasion in Ukraine, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, really exposed a lot of these complacency that we had. Germany has been changing its strategy. It was severely criticized at the beginning for being very inactive in helping. The same applies to the European Union, to many different countries. And the reason why is we just presume that things are doing well. We presume that if we engage with these dictators, they will someday, magically turn our ally or believe in what we treasure, believe in our democratic values. Or even worse, we know that they're not going to listen, but we pretend that it's okay for them to continue their trajectory. It's okay for them to continue to persecute their people. And we just increase our reliance on them. We just have more engagement with them. And suddenly, when an unimaginable invasion broke out, it was like waking many people from that kind of wishful thinking. And we started to really think about, oh yes, actually things are so bad that we should have reacted a decade ago. And I think that awakening is what we need. As I said, before we address the rise of authoritarianism, we must first recognize that. We must first be aware of our complacency, why we were not reacting to that for the past decades. And for now, what are things that we can do to better equip ourselves is, of course, reduce our reliance on them, continue to develop global pushback, work with like-minded allies. All these things are crucial for us to have a global pushback. But if we're talking about what it will happen if a society itself turns to more authoritarian, and in my book Freedom, I've just published a book about my story and the story of Hong Kong last November. I dedicate chapters to, for example, the situation of press freedom in Hong Kong. The government will use a lot of ways to dissolve independent media organization. They will restrict the means to do investigative journalism. They will even prosecute journalists for doing so. They will be targeting political organizations. They will be continue to campaign about living under a dictatorship is fine. They will roll out massive propaganda campaign. I think what we have to understand is this is not only the things that would happen in a totalitarian society. It will happen everywhere if we are not vigilant enough to try to hold the government accountable. So I think this is the one lesson that Hong Kong could bring out. Like what we have suffered for the past few years is actually like a toolbox. It's like a list of the authoritarian reform that you would have. And if you take a look at what had happened and maybe compare it to where you're living, you may see some signs of it.
I really like this idea, or your comment regarding complacency, because I think it's easy to just think that things are the way they are and maybe not see what privileges or freedoms you have. So I'm really curious, were you complacent at some point before? And if you were, what made you change your mind? What made you realize, oh, something is happening and I need to go and occupy city center?
Oh, definitely. I grew up in a blue-collar family. My parents are immigrants. Like my father, who was from mainland China, he swam and took a raft boat trip for 3 days and smuggled from mainland China to Hong Kong. And he was a political and economic kind of like refugee, but they don't have that term. So he successfully migrated to Hong Kong, and they have that kind of like refugee mentality that they knew the political turmoil, the famine, and every problem in mainland China was actually the cause of totalitarianism. But they don't really want their future generation to mess up with them because they think they're unwinnable, they're just too strong. So I grew up in a family in the roughest neighborhood in Hong Kong. My childhood was following my mother, who was a cleaner, to go to pick up garbage. I didn't learn about democracy. I didn't learn about human rights in my home education. All they wanted me to do was to be educated, to find a good job, and to climb up the social ladder. But I think for me that being involved in politics and activism was really a lot of coincidence, a lot of options that I didn't know it will make me the person I am today. So in my high school, I was inspired by the work of Liu Xiaobo, who was a Chinese dissident who was awarded Nobel Peace Prize but died in China's custody because of his campaign for China democracy. And then when I was in university, I decided as a half intellectual, that's how I branded myself. I needed to be involved in activism. And when I was the representative of my school's student union, then we had the umbrella movement. And I subsequently was stepped into the limelight. So a lot of the options that I had been taken, I didn't know what it would lead me. I just feel like as a person with conscience, as a person that I wanted myself when I grow old, when my hair turned gray or turned white, or I don't have any. I hope it doesn't happen. But and when I look into the mirror and I don't hate the one that I'm seeing, I think it takes a large part of my life doing the decision that I feel right, that I feel it's good, it fits my conscience to do, to make that things happen. So it's a lot of consequence to make myself who I am today, which I'm not like a groomed politician. I'm not living in a political family. I don't have power. I don't have money behind me. And it's just a lot of, like, when you live in such a big era, an era of change, a tiny decision that you made could result in big.
So I think one thing that's quite, when you look at Hong Kong now, like you talked about the erosion of freedoms, political activism is quite difficult. If you protest like 3 years ago would probably not happen, or people would be arrested. You yourself are in exile. Also, looking more broadly, when looking at Hong Kong as someone who is a democracy activist, the situation seems quite bleak from the outside. And you yourself are quite busy abroad, but you can't do activism in Hong Kong anymore. So I'm really curious, and maybe this is also a lesson for something that people can take away for elsewhere. When you are in a situation like that, where do you find hope? And what makes you believe that what you're doing can result in change? Like, where do you get that feeling?
We all have big projects, big imagination, the things that we think the society can be better. No matter it's on environmental cause, in diversity, in gender, in racial equality. Democracy is one of them. And as an activist, for me, I get used to defeat. Many of these causes are not going to change simultaneously, like in a glimpse, in a short time. And for us, and for me especially, when I've been through so much turbulence, so much defeat, what matters more is how I can learn from it and how I can get back up stronger by learning from these defeats. And so, for me, hope is a very abstract thing. If you see all the defeats as process and you're an ongoing product of it, you may feel less helpless because you are really feeling like you are part of a big picture, big project, and there's continuity in between movement and in between people who have sacrificed or committed in the movement, and you're just part of the process that you humbly devote yourself into a cause. So I would say that the reality is grim. We are seeing rights of women, rights of minority being rolled back everywhere in the world. We're also seeing rights of people in Hong Kong, in Ukraine, in Myanmar, in Thailand, that are being taken away. We're not living in a world of optimism. Maybe many of you, when you grew up in the 80s and 90s, you feel like the world is going to be better. There is always hope. We will conquer. But this is not the mentality that we have in our generation for now. But that's the reason why we have to overcome that. As an activist, your duty is to inspire, empower, or to a certain extent, when you are clever enough, to enlighten people to stand beside you and to walk through all those turmoil, even though they are really tough. But you are the person who tries to guide them and walk and make them to walk with you. So I guess I'm in no position to say that I'm losing my hope. As long as I'm seeing there are still people resisting, there are still people wanted to help us, wanted to walk that path with us, then I wouldn't say that there is no hope, even though we should not be blindly optimistic. Being blindly optimistic is stupid. But feeling absolutely no hope is even more dumb. So that's how I see what is going on.
So a call for keeping going and maybe at the same time being pragmatic. So very briefly, so we don't run over time, do you have one, you mentioned learning from defeat. Is there one lesson from a defeat in the past that you would want to share with everyone else before we go?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've had a huge impression on was sometimes when you are in the middle of something, you feel like it was so bad. But when you look back, it was actually a lesson to help you grow. It reminds me the life when I was in prison. I spent several months there because of my peaceful advocacy work. I was surrounded by like gangsters, people who like really did crimes, and I was living in a completely different world from them. But I had the opportunity to listen to them. I had all the time because in prison, what you needed to do is to kill time. You just have so much time that you don't have outside of the prison bars. And you have the opportunity to listen to them, to hear about how they think, to hear about why they would end up doing things that they're doing. And most of the time, actually, sometimes they're a good person. They just, unfortunately, being born in a wrong time, in a wrong neighborhood, with a group of wrong friends. And when you don't have that kind of like conflict of interest with them, they actually treat you nicely. They were polite. And they were also showing a world that I didn't know. I was a legislator, so people voted for me. I got 50,000 votes from people. And I was supposed to know about the society. And spending time in jail actually made me know a bit more about society, made me know a bit more about how a trajectory could affect a person. So I think looking back, even though I was like, I was so it was so difficult for me, but it was actually making my life more compassionate, more able to understand from the other's shoot, and making your actions and your advocacy more impactful and affectionate in that term. So when you look back, sometimes when things are past, what you originally feel like it was so terrible can actually become a blessing for you.
Well, thank you. Please give a round of applause to Nathan Law. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
Vielen Dank.